So good morning, everyone at the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum. I'm delighted to have with us today Catherine Gallant, who's a dancer and choreographer, and they're to talk about her new show, which will be performed at the end of this week, Escape from the House of Mercy. They're performing at the Performance Project at University Settlement on March 21st and 22nd. And when Catherine contacted me, I thought this was very fascinating because you have a history, Catherine, of choreographing dance around kind of tragedy and particularly women's stories. So we have a kind of a two-pronged approach today, I hope, in our conversation. I definitely want to hear about this project and what the House of Mercy was, but also your work previously in Ireland, where you were preparing for this one when you danced at Portumna Workhouse and investigated mother and baby homes and things in Ireland. So welcome, Catherine, and thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So if you tell us a little bit first of all about the inspiration for the new
Mhm.
piece, Escape from the House of Mercy, and how it came about.
All right. Well, as a choreographer living here in New York City, it's very important to find your funding before you have a wonderful idea. Uh, and so it really came in a search for a grant that was being supported through the Partnership for Parks in Upper Manhattan. And I knew it had the ask had to have something to do with Inwood Hill Park, which I knew very little about, except that it's a very beautiful place with a large hill. And so in my research, I started learning about different institutions that were in the park, and one of them was called the House of Mercy. And it was a place considered wayward women and girls. And at this time, you could end up in the House of Mercy for walking alone at night as a single female person. Um, Often women were brought there by someone in their family. And it really was supposed to be a place of refuge, but it was, in fact, a workhouse, essentially, where it was often laundry or other kinds of jobs. And so, in submitting the grant with this background information, I received the initial grant, which helped me to begin the process of understanding how this narrative would become an embodiment in movement. And I began working with my group on different sections, on ideas. A lot of it came collaboratively. That's often how I work with dance artists, using their ideas, bouncing off of our ideas, exploring the research together. And so the initial performance happened in Wood Hill Park in 2019. It was at that time 1/2 an hour, and it had live music. The music was actually New Orleans funeral band because I didn't want to use recorded sound, and it was something that would fill the vastness of outdoors. So already it was starting to have a kind of cross-cultural references. Um, and then in 2019 is when I went to Dublin to learn more. And at that time, a wonderful artist, Alison Lowry, had an exhibit at the National Museum in Dublin. And in that exhibit, I saw the images of the Magdalen laundries that she had expanded with her vision. Her main material, her main media was glass. And so those images were part of the exhibition. But one thing that I had no idea about were the interviews that had started to be collected by the Justice for the Magdalens organization. So in that exhibit, one could put the headphones on and hear the voices of women who had been inhabitants of the Magdalene laundries and hear their individual experiences. You're hearing their stories from decades earlier. Um, and so that, when I came back to New York after that experience, I began working more on the project and expanding it. It turned into an hour-long dance theater experience, and we were ready to share it, to premiere it in April of 2020. So that story, we know it was absolutely canceled, and we managed over the next few years to stay together, stay connected, continue the research. Uh, there were many offshoots of research, and right before COVID, I attended an event at the Ford Foundation that was focused on incarcerated women from Louisiana. It was called Per Sister. So all of these other ideas were starting to filter into the work. Even then, we were canceled. I did a lot more um, research. We made short dances for the camera. For example, during COVID, I sent each dancer, because they were in different parts of the country, I sent them their costume and they made videos of themselves performing in different atmospheres, different environments. And that became a dance for the camera. Um, We also did a masked performance that was very short. That was in early 2021. So we managed, because we were committed to the idea, to somehow stay together and stay with it. Um, so
So
it,
you're covering a lot of ground there, Catherine.
yes, sorry, yeah. A lot of ground,
So
yeah.
if you can we go back a step and maybe just
Mhm.
talk about because there's so much fascinating. Like I think the
Yeah,
artistic process and the creativity is one thing, but then how to maintain, the integrity of the creative
yeah,
process while you're on Zoom and on distance and all of
yeah.
that. But can you talk to us a little bit, I guess, first of all, about the stories of the girls in Inwood?
Hmm.
As a historian, I'm all about the stories, obviously. And then we
Yes.
can maybe look and compare and contrast with Ireland, because I think you've raised an interesting point there too about
Hmm.
those reports, and that was probably breaking while you were in Ireland, that there was some discontent about even how gathering those evidences in Ireland, and
Yes.
and who was allowed kind of to testify and what qualified as
Hmm.
testimony. And so I think,
Hmm.
there's a lot of storytelling and gatekeeping stories that
Yes.
you're uncovering here. So let's
Yes.
start with, some
Okay.
of the stories from the Inwood girls, if you wouldn't mind, and we'll go
Yes.
from there.
Yes. Well, what was shocking about the stories at Inwood was the treatment of women and girls who were there. And in order to, one of the things that was done is, if inmates were somehow being disruptive or not following the protocols, they were threatened with having their hair cut. And that often did happen. They saw it as a way to control some of the behaviors. And there were a lot of very young women there who were constantly trying to find ways to escape. So there was also being put away into a very small space away from the group. So some removal from the group and confinement in very small spaces. Um, Very grueling work that might go on for 10, 12, 16 hours a day. So there was that. Also, this method of no no one was able to speak to others while they were working. And in fact, there were most of the times, unless you were unobserved, you were not allowed to speak to any other um, of the workers or of the inmates, inhabitants, whatever you want to call them. So there's this silence, enforced silence, the physical abuse of the threatening, um, of punishments, very poor diet, very little food, and the food that was given was often something that was refused from other places outside and then given um, to those who were monitoring the workhouse, and then that was used as food for the people that were there. Um, so all of those things combined with a sense of desperation that you were either dropped off by your family or you were not able to communicate. There is a story where our title comes from a story of three girls who attempted to escape. They were later returned, but they were quite daring and plotted their escape over a number of months and were able to find a time of the day where they could climb over a wall. So it was a kind of classic over a wall with tying sheets together, that type of escape idea. And they were able, as I said, to escape, but then later were returned. And I got a lot of my history from this book called Lost in Wood that was um, compiled by a regional historian, Cole Thompson. Um, and that's where I found all of this information. I don't know how I would have learned about it otherwise. I'm sure in the archives of New York City, some of it might exist there, but this really brought it all together with images of the building, images surrounding the building in Woodhill Park. The building itself was torn down in the early 1930s. Um, but I was able to understand where it was in the park. So part of our 2019 event was a pre-show walk up the hill to what we imagined was the actual site. And the site was high on a hill overlooking the Hudson River. So you could see out of these bar-covered windows. Um, it's not unlike other institutions, even now that we have in New York City that are either in the middle of the East River or somewhere on the edges. I'm thinking of Rikers Island, where yes, you can look out, but you are completely held and contained. So there was that feeling for the women and girls that were there, that you're in this possibly beautiful place, but you're not, able to communicate or escape.
And Catherine, were those girls, and I had a cursory kind of look, I read like some of them no more than in Ireland, their own families kind of are
Yeah.
complicit with handing them over, or
Hmm.
sometimes they're
Hmm.
orphans and they're kind of sent, out of the orphanage.
Right.
So, um, were they, I, were they all pregnant, or was it just the fear that they might become pregnant, or they were just disobedient, wayward women? Some they weren't even pregnant.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in Inwood it was a wide combination of reasons that women and girls were there. I'm sure that was a large part of it. But for example, a husband could commit their wife to the House of Mercy for one reason or another. So that this idea that a woman's own volition was just so low in society that that could happen. In the late 1800s, early 1900s. Um, but yes, it wasn't specifically um, for women and girls who were pregnant. But I believe also in my research, there was an institution that referred to Magdalene, like the Magdalene Home for Girls. So there was a separate um, entity. I think that was more focused in that way. So there were two. There was also a tuberculosis hospital, some
Mhm.
kind of sanatorium. So there were a number of institutions in the park. And at that same time, we had Blackwell's Island, which is now
Mhm.
Roosevelt Island, with other hospitals and poorhouses. Yeah, so it was part of a time when social support um, was about containment. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Um, And so, then you're looking at the Irish story, which of course it
Mm,
was mainly unmarried girls or unmarried pregnant girls. And again, not always pregnant, but, in
right.
danger of becoming fallen.
Hmm. Hmm.
When you were there, and because it kind of contrasts the story, I suppose that, it's 100 years later in Ireland when they're
Right.
grappling with this legacy. And of course, in Ireland, the last Magdalen home closed, I think, in 1997. They were
Yeah.
certainly operational into the 1980s. And by then, maybe most of the women who lived there were institutionalized, and
Right.
weren't really able to be released. Um,
Right.
did you have any sense of, the contrast between a sort of a modern Ireland and the stories being collected, and then how did that fit in with these echoes from Inwood?
Mm. Well, I did have a personal experience right after visiting the National Museum, and I stayed for hours in that exhibit because those interviews and the collected images had really affected me. And so coming out into the sunlight, I was walking toward the train, and uh, I spoke with a woman waiting for the train. I don't know how we got to talking. I said I was just at that exhibit, and it was called Addressing Our Hidden Truths. And somehow we were speaking about it, and because I was just very curious about this same question, how could it be that that families allowed this to happen, or that even initiated it? And she said something, oh, well, you have to understand that Irish families had many, many children. And maybe it's, difficult to understand how that could have affected people's decisions. So that was her take on it. Uh, so I don't know what her background was. I mean, she was
Yeah, that seems a bit,
Irish citizen, but
yeah.
so I that made me think about it in a slightly different way.
Mm,
And there have been, well, certainly many, many books and films that reference that period, um, but also more into modern history, as you're referring to, like small things like these. I had read that
mhm.
novel when it first came out, and now, it's made into a film, but you kind of get that sense within those stories that there's always many, many factors
Yeah,
at play here. And also the lack of women's rights, reproductive rights,
yeah,
that allowed that to persist maybe much longer than it would have. And the irony of in the US, how that has kind of shifted back from the 1970s to now.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
Was that something you were anticipating? I mean, I suppose by 2020 we kind of all were aware, that there
mhm.
was stirrings here in America, but it must have been kind of shocking, in the last 2 or 3 years to see the change. And especially every time I speak to Irish Americans, they comment on Ireland voted in, like or we repealed the Eighth Amendment, and we voted as a democracy for instance, like the broadening of the marriage rates, so that same-sex marriage could occur. So that was done by plebiscite and not just by
Yeah,
laws.
yeah.
And so there's kind of been this reversal almost, that as Ireland becomes more liberal and more accepting, America is actually kind of retrenching a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard for me to grasp that, to understand it.
Yeah.
And and most of the people I know are consciously working against that.
Yeah.
Um, there were some wonderful artists visiting the Irish Arts Center this fall,
Mm.
and they spoke a lot, and their work was connected to their activism in repealing the
Hmm.
Eighth Amendment. And one artist was Hetty Judah, and others who were visual artists and created this amazing fabric art, a kind of map that
Hmm.
referenced um, that history and the laundries and
Yeah.
the work that it took, the grassroots work that it took for that repeal to
Yeah.
happen. Um,
Yeah, I saw that. That was beautiful.
yeah, yeah. So
Mm.
that was also continued to inspire our work
Yeah.
as we look at it and find these relevant points in it. What we do is an embodiment. It's an abstraction, but it's completely informed
Okay.
by these narratives,
Yeah.
um, beginning with this idea of the House of Mercy in Wood Hill Park, but then including other women's rights issues that are happening in other parts of the world, like recently in Afghanistan, that a woman is not allowed, we can't hear her voice in public. Um, so that just very visceral connection to women's visibility, their voices, is very um, impactful
Hmm.
for this work. So we want to make those connections. I did speak to someone who works with women at Rikers Island and that
Hmm.
part of the prison, and hearing her stories of her connections with individuals and with the institution itself, there were very strong parallels,
Hmm.
both to the past and what we're looking at right now in the present.
Yeah. And then, in terms of the performance, Catherine, I saw your video of the performance in Portumna, and I was
Oh,
struck when you said earlier
mhm.
on that these places are ostensibly beautiful. I mean, particularly the Inwood building was gorgeous in that kind of
Yeah,
gothic, slightly creepy way.
right,
But
right.
it's up there on the hill, and you can see the river, and it was a
Hmm.
large acreage, but very, as you said, contained, and you're kind of conscious that you're surrounded maybe and
Mm,
held isolated. And then, as you said, these women are sometimes in very small cells or forbidden from speaking. So there's a sense of smallness and narrowness in this big
mm,
building, which must have been the same in the workhouses and the laundries at home. So what has that, or how did that impact on your sense of performance? Like, are your movements big and wild and free, or are they controlled and narrow? And
oh,
how does that
hmm
affect the
hmm
dance?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Well, it's both, because sometimes we are expressing the need, the inner life, the need to break out, to escape, the need to protect against the harshness of the environment, the way that when people are treated in that harsh manner, that's how they tend to treat others in the world. So those kinds of relationships, um, revealing that, but there is both expanded movement of desire to escape, but also very held and contained movement. There's many props that also express that. We're often using this light net fabric that is a way of being both hidden and protected. So that's a thematic element. There's about 45 white shirts that are configured in different ways that represent the work. Uh, and there's songs, poetry, spoken text, um, so that it in that way is a sort of multimedia
Yeah.
experience. Um, There, we did a lot of, as I said earlier, collaborative work. There was one time where we did a drawing, dancers did a drawing exercise where you don't lift your implement off the paper, but you try to capture an image. So dancers drew what they felt the House of Mercy would, the edifice of the House of Mercy. Not
Mm,
everyone had seen what that was. And so then those lines of the drawing became pathways that people used to travel through the space. So there's many, many, many layers that after a while, an observer wouldn't know how that was created, but we used a lot of connections in our own way of mining different ideas of movement.
okay.
Uh, yeah.
And so your performance is on the 21st and 22nd down at the performance, what did I call it? The performance
Perf project, performance
project. Yeah.
project at University Settlement. We are going to show after the main performance, we're going to screen Stone's Whispers from the Workhouse, which was it's a it is related to that performance, but it's a dance made for the camera at Portumna, which was not beautiful. Like the House of Mercy, but
Yeah.
yeah, it was a very that was also that's all like a whole other story in a way,
Mhm.
having been there too. So yeah.
And so people can buy tickets online, I guess, through the University Settlement or Performance Project and just go and see this because it sounds like it's going to be an amazingly moving, you know, performance, really. And I love this, of course, New York history, but the fact that there is this unfortunate legacy for
Mm,
women's history, where you're
yes.
silenced and confined, is very, very touching, I think. And as you said, unfortunately, more relevant today than it had been even 10 years ago. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And I know that in our world right now, audience goers uh, might not go to hear yet another really terribly inhumane story, but I hope that it's something that sheds a light on this and that people will want to learn more and become more engaged.
Yeah. I hope so too. And I mean, art and discussions like this elevate the topic and hopefully inspire conversation and pushback. And so,
Yes.
that expression democracy dies in darkness, we have to have sunlight as a disinfectant and talk
Mm,
about these things because the more they're talked about, the less maneuvering can happen in
mm,
silence, let's hope. And so, I think it's a beautiful testimony to the women and girls of 100 years ago and 50 years ago, but it's also kind of a clarion cry for today, and that there is something we can
yes.
do. And so, even just to support the arts, which are continually under threat anyway, Yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes,
Not
that
at all.
was,
Delighted to do it.
yes, thank
Mhm.
you. Thank you.
So, everyone, I would urge you, there is, I'll try actually and link it when I put this video up, Catherine. I can link if you'd like to the video of the Portumna. I think that's on your own webpage.
Yes.
Yeah, that performance, so those of you who are not in New York, will go, but I would urge you to try and get tickets for the 21st and 22nd here in the city if you're here. It looks to be a beautiful event at the University Settlement Performance Project. And congratulations, Catherine, on getting everything off the ground and on bringing these stories to light. Thank you very
Thank,
much.
thank you. Thank you.